Hello, welcome to this class. Well, this tutorial is mainly for technical business analysts that maybe wants to go into API projects or that wants to attend an interview that has to do with API, and even also for project managers that want to attend an interview or wants to understand the kind of projects around API. I wouldn't say it's mainly for developers because the developers they write codes. We are not going to be teaching how to write codes in this tutorial. However, for a developer that wants to understand the kind of things that happens in API projects, this tutorial could be beneficial to you as well. By the way, I'm a technical business analyst for some years experience now. I have worked in various kinds of API projects, both in building new API and or even also API uplift or API improvement or even API migration, migrating API from one technological stack to another technological stack, or API uplift or in terms of changing fields or making one change or the other. So I have quite substantial experience in working API projects. All right, so let's go into the tutorial. So these are the objectives I've mapped out for this tutorial. First is to um, look at API concept to understand, what's API, how API operates, just have a concept about API, and we can now see how APIs work, and we can use human activities scenario to explain API to bring it to your understanding, and we can now see API at work using an application. So I believe at the end of this tutorial, you will be able to go into API projects or API interview as a business analyst or a project manager or scrum master confidently. Okay. Now, the first thing, what is an API? What is an application programming interface? As I have defined it here, an API or application programming interface, that's what API stands for. API, application programming interface, is an interface used by programs to interact with an application. Now, when you see programs, the first thing that will come to your mind are programmers, developers, they write codes, programmers, they write codes. So if API is an application programming interface, what you have to understand is that API is a set of programs, codes. They are codes, right? API are a set of codes that enable two or systems or applications to interact with each other. Okay. All right. Looking at this, I believe anyone that is watching this tutorial, if you're watching this tutorial from a house, except if you're in a desert or bush, if you're in a house watching this tutorial, if you look on your right or left, you must have been looking at this right now. This is electrical socket that's attached to a wall, okay, or wall socket, okay. So everyone must have seen this, or you have this in your home or your houses right now. So this is an interface, okay, that was given to us to plug in our electrical appliance. Whatever that is happening behind this wall, we don't really know and we don't really care to know. The electrician that built the electrical conduits and other things behind this wall and wiring, they built everything, connected it to the power generator, to whatever they got the power source from, and they gave us an interface, this little socket via which we can connect our electrical appliances in order to get current. So this is a kind of electrical interface, or we can call it an API, even though it's not, not really codes, but it's an interface that enables us to connect our electrical devices. Okay. Now, for you to connect your electrical device to this socket, you don't just get your television or your iron or your fan and just put it in here. You will need another interface that your electrical appliance will use to connect to this electrical socket. Okay, the electrical or fan or television or iron would have to, have a plug that it will use to connect to this wall. So that will take us to the next slide. So this is the interface I'm talking about. We have this wall socket here, and we have another interface here, which is the plug. So this plug, let's say this is the interface of your electrical appliance, maybe your television or your iron. Now, this will enable you to connect to this socket. So there are two interfaces here. One, the electrical socket. Another one is the plug. Now, looking at these two things, you should know that one is sending a request and the other one is responding to that request. So you can see that this electrical plug or your appliance plug is the one making a request to this one. So what is the request? I need power or current in order to power my um, television. So your television is making a request via this plug. So your television will say, okay, I need current, I want it to come on. So this request will pass through this plug. And remember, this plug will do a bit of kind of validation before it can pass that current, that request to this one. Let's say, the voltage, it has to make sure that the voltage that is getting, is a kind of matches what is required. So when it sends the request to this one, of course, this one will also do a kind of check to ensure that the voltage that is being requested is compliant with what the television is sending, or is compliant to what the that should be received. So this one is sending a request. So this electrical circuit will now get power and respond to this one, and this one will now transmit that current, which is the response. So the request here is that I need power. So this will now, the circuit will now respond with the power that this circuit will now transmit to the appliance that needs it. Okay, this is exactly how API works. One is making a request. So in an API project, you need to find out the API you are working on. Are you the one making the request, or you are the one responding to your request? So if you're the one responding to the request, you are the back end. If you are the one making the request, you are the front end API. So you are sending a request to the back end, or you are the one receiving the request. And if you receive a request, you have to respond to that request. Okay. Now, first thing you need to understand in any API project is to understand the journey of that API. As I said initially, you need to find out which one is making a request or which one is responding to understand the journey of the API. Are you working on an API project where you're the one making a request, or you are the one responding to a request? So if you're the one making the request, so you need to find out, that's what we call your responsibility in that project. So your responsibility in the API you're working on, are you the consumer or you are the producer? So if you are the one making a request, you are the one consuming the you are the one that's going to consume the response. So going back to this is the consumer here, because this is the one that will consume the electricity that will be coming from here. You make the request, the circuit will respond to this circuit, and this circuit will consume. So if you are the consumer, that means you are the front end. Yeah. So if you're the consumer, you are the front end API. If you are the producer, you are the back end. So here at the front end, or the consumer. So if you're working on the back end, that means you are the producer. You are producing for the front end to consume your API. Okay. It should be we, the producer, are producing for the front end to consume our API, right? So if you're the one producing, the front end is consuming your API. But if you are the consumer, that means the back end will be the one that will produce to you to consume your API. Okay. I hope this is clear. Let's go to the next slide. Now, when you understand the journey, another vital artifact that you as a business analyst must produce in any API project is what called API specification or API spec. This is the kind of the body of truth of what that API contains. So this is where you find you document the API requirements. If you're going to be building new APIs, your API specification will contain all the requirements that will be required in building that API. Also, or if you're going to be working or improve an API, any API you're going to work on, the first thing you need to ask is, can I see the API specification? Can I see the specification of that API? That's where you'll be able to see the requirements or the as is of that API before you can now determine what is the to be. Even in the to be, you also have to update this API spec. Now, the next question, what does API spec contain? Of course, API specification contains so many things. As I said, it contains the entire requirements of the API you'll be building. So some of the things that API spec will contain are the things I'm going to talk about here. I'm not going to talk about everything, but I'm going to talk about one of the or some of the most important things that your API spec must contain. Even your journey, as I talked about, your responsibility that I talked about earlier on, all this will also be in your API spec. You talk about the API name, that API spec. Are you documenting the API spec are you using for the front end or the back end? Now, the next thing you need to find out the URL or the endpoint. The URL or the endpoint. What is the endpoint? Now, the front end, when you are the one producing, if you're working in a back end API, that means you are the one that will produce the URL or the endpoint that the front end will use to interface with your API. Let me say it again. If you are working in the back end, or you are the one producing you're working in the producer, or you are working in a back-end API, that means you will be the one that will produce the endpoint or the URL. So you're exposing an interface. Okay, this is the address or the URL or the endpoint that the other API will use to interact or to interface with our API. Okay, but if you are working in the front-end API, or you are the one consuming, so as a business analyst, you will have to request from the backend. Okay, we want to connect your API. Can you give us your endpoint or the URL that we use to connect your API? All right. So the URL will come in this form, HTTPS slash, the address, whatever address they give you. So of course, the backend will give you that endpoint. But if you're working in a backend API, as I said, as a business analyst, you don't necessarily be the one that will produce all this information. It's just for you to know the information, know what to ask. So it could be your solution architects or the technical team, the developers. They are the one that will give you the endpoint that you will not expose of, or your document that which you will not send to the front end um, team, which they will use to connect your API. Okay. The next thing is that the API type. What type of API are you working on? There are two major types of APIs, which one is the SOAP API or REST API. I'm going to talk about these two, um, soon in the coming slides to talk more about this. So you have to understand what type of API is this SOAP API or REST API. Okay. Now, if you're talking about SOAP API, of course, you're talking about these are called also protocols, right? API type or API protocol. So whether you say call it protocols or type, okay, SOAP or REST API. So you talk about the return codes. What are the return codes? Return code is that you as a consumer, because remember you're the one making the request to the back end as a consumer. Okay. When you send your request to the other API, to the back end API, that back end API should be able to give you response codes that will determine whether your request was successful or not. Okay. So as I said, all this information, you don't have to generate them, but you need to understand what they are and also know the right questions to ask. For example, when you make a request to the backend API, if when the backend API receive your request, they will do a kind of validation to validate whether that's your request. They will do what we call validation against schema. They can even check the format of that API. If it's a REST API or SOAP API, they will do a kind of the format of that request. There are a lot of validation that will be done. Of course, they will tell you all this information, but what you need to do, you have to understand as a business analyst, is to understand if that request is successful. When you do this validation, every validation will be responded with a return code. If it's a validation of, let's say, validation against schema, what is the code that we receive to show that validation was successful? It could be 200, it could be 203, it could be any number. They will give you those return codes, but there are some standard return codes you can check out on internet. But it's usually 200 or 203 is usually the success code that you will receive. So when your API receives this code, it's an indication that your validation was successful. Now, if there was an error in that validation, if the validation was not successful, also the backend API will also give you a response. So when you see a response, that will help your API determine what kind of, the state of that request. If the request is, if there's an error, you can send 400 or 403 or depending. So the error you receive determine the kind of error, the code you receive rather will determine the kind of error. So there are some API that there has to be a kind of authentication to authenticate that API before you even do the validation. So let's say the back end might give you the consumer, username and password that you encode in your request, so that when your request hits their API, first time the API will try to authenticate that request first to know whether it's coming from the right source. So if they authenticate using the username and password that they gave you initially, which your developers included in your request. Okay. So when that request hits their own API, their API will now run a kind of check if that authentication is successful, it will send you a code. So, okay, maybe 400, or sorry, if that authentication is not successful, it could send you error code saying, no, we couldn't authenticate your request. So let's say if you receive 403, that's to tell you that our request was our username and password that we entered was not correct or something. Then when the authentication is successful, it will now try to validate that request against what we call schema. So if there's a system failure somewhere on all these things, so you'll be able to get some certain codes. 500 is usually when there's a system failure from somewhere, they will send you 500. So you can read more about return codes. Okay. So the next thing you need to determine is the source and target system. Where is that request coming from? So the request can be coming from a web application. That web application will send that when the request, let's say somebody wants to book flight, which we'll use that as an example. If I go to Skyscanner and I enter the date I want to travel, the airports I want to travel from, the city I want to go to. So that is the source system now. Yeah, let's I'm on Skyscanner. So when I send that, the source system, the API should be able to take this request from the source system and also the target system. Okay, so the source system is usually the front end and the target system is the back end. Okay, the next thing you need to understand also is what we call deployment environment. Before your API can be deployed, that's before it goes live, they go through certain stages when the developers are building these APIs. Okay, first it goes through what called the development stage environment, where they will write the codes, develop the codes. After developing the codes, you now go into staging environment. This staging environment is where there are a series of tests. Of course, there are a lot of environments within this staging stage, so they will run this kind of tests. After that, they will now move into the production or live stage. As I said, you don't have to be the one to produce all this. So it's just for you to know, to ask the right question. Maybe you come to your developers or your team, say, okay, what are the environments, deployment environments that this API will go through before they go live? So they will tell you all those information, then you document them. But you need to understand, as a business analyst, some of these stages and some of these environments. Okay. So there's what we call request schema. So this schema is the schema that when you now send in a request, as I said earlier on, that request will be validated against schema. What is schema? Schema is like the definition of a database. Let's say I want to make a request. Now your API will now be sending a request to the backend API, where they will now go and check to the database to get a response to you. For example, let's say if I want to log into a web application where I've already created my account. All right. Now the schema will define that the particular field, let's say the field says that, let's say the password field says that it can only take strange character. The field where I'm supposed to enter password. Now, when you go there and you're entering digit numbers, if the schema says that that field is only strange character that will be allowed in that field, and you're entering your numbers, digits, when this API does that validation against schema, you get an error saying, no, it cannot receive integers or digit numbers. So why it couldn't allow you to pass through that stage using integer is because it has been defined in the schema that that field can only take in strange characters. Okay, when we go into practical, we'll be able to understand a little bit more. So schema is definition of database. Of course, you know that database is collection of tables or objects, and data is stored in data, so data is stored in tables. Okay, so all these things are defined in schema, and so all those kind of things that you have to understand, you know about schema. Okay, so let's proceed. So here we'll talk about BA tools and artifacts. These are some of the tools that you expected to have in an API project. One of the, if not one of the most important tool as a BA that you need to have in an API project is what called XML Spy. There could be other tools out there that does similar thing, but I don't really know about them. But the ones I've only used in validating my schema is XML Spy. Okay, but it's a very vital, important tool that you need to know how to use it. What does XML Spy do? What does it do? So let's read through the. I said that XML Spy is one of the best tools for editing, debugging, and coding in XML and JSON formats. Okay, remember I said initially that API are codes and they are written. And when you talk of schema, okay, when I talk about what kind of API, remember I talked about SOAP or REST. So if you are working on SOAP API has a language. XML is the language, programming language for SOAP. Jensen is a programming language for REST. Although REST can also, you can use XML and Jensen you can use XML and or Jensen in a REST API. I will talk more about that when we go into the next slide. But for now, what I wanted to explain to you what XML spy, what it does. Okay. So when you as a BA, when you receive your schema, the backend will send you their schema. That is the definition of their database, which you will use that to build your API. So that the API can conform. When you're building your API, you build your API so that they can conform to the backend schema. Okay. So when they send you this schema, that's the definition of their database. You as a business analyst, you don't really know codes, and this schema are a set of codes. It could be XML or it could be JSON. Yeah. So they are codes for programming language. So as a business analyst, you might not, you don't have to know codes. Okay. So what you do when you receive those schema, you load them in this XML spy. The XML spy will help you to validate that codes to see if there are errors. You know, sometimes when they are writing these codes, there could be error. So when you receive that schema or those schemas, you will load them in XML spy, and you'll be able to identify, validate whether there is error or not. And also XML spy will be able to help you to see those codes or see those fields or objects and their definitions in a proper way or in a tabular way, not in codes format. Yeah, you can see them in a tabular way where it will make more sense or you can understand it easily. For example, if they say that let's say in a web application that they say that this field schema will contain objects, and these objects will define the fields of their database. Okay, this field is saying that maybe for password field it can only take string. For username field it can only take string. For date field it can only be date. For this kind of all these fields, right, they will define the fields. You even need to know the maximum character size that will be allowed in that schema, okay, or that will be allowed in the fields. So XML spy will help you to determine like the field type, the field size, even the number of fields in an object. Some of these things that you need to put in your API specification. Okay, it's not really difficult as per se. It's something that when you get them, you can easily go on YouTube to check out how they operate. But it's a very important tool that will help you as a business analyst to work in an API project. Okay, so you can read more about it. So as I said, schema is the structure or blueprint of a database. Schema contains objects or tables. So when I say object, it's more like tables in an SQL project. Okay, in an SQL database. Okay, so objects has attributes such as field name, field type, size. So these are the kind of things that you'll be able to see when you use XML spy. When you load the schema in XML spy, you will clearly see the field names, the field type, the size, and the other things, and also validate that schema if there are errors in any way. Okay. So another important thing you need to know as a business analyst is the kind of artifacts you produce in an API project. The first one, as I talked about initially, was the API specs, okay, which can be documented in Confluence, or it could be, depending on the tool your company use. But the one I usually use, Confluence, use Confluence to document API specs. Also, I need to let you know that you don't have to always, in most of the organizations where you go into, these API specs, you can get the templates, okay, from there is always templates from there, so you can copy a template and now populate it. So you just understand the journey of your API, and you can get a template from one of the API projects they've done. Then you can now just populate it with information that you need for your own API project. Okay. So as a business analyst, obviously you write user stories and acceptance criteria that can be documented using Jira, Azure DevOps, or whatever tool that your organization use. Okay. Then you map the process. You map the journey, showing the API journey. So moreover, when you are building new APIs, when you're working in a project where you have to build new APIs, for your developers to build those API, when you get all these requirements, as a BA, you have to map the process to show the journey where the request is coming from, the kind of validation, authentication at the stages where they will happen, the return codes. So all these things, you have to capture them in the process, in your process map. Remember, your developers, they don't have time to read through all this documentation. You as a business analyst, your job is to make the work easier for the developers to do. So you are the one that will go and get all those requirements. After capturing all the requirements, you will now map them in a process where they can now clearly see the entire journey. So developers are the ones that write the programs which consumes API. So as a business analyst, you don't write the codes, but the developers will write the programs based on the requirements that you've documented in your API spec. Okay, as I said earlier on, that I'm going to talk about these API protocols. That's SOAP API and REST API. So there are two major API protocols or two major API types that are used today: SOAP API and REST API. Sometimes they call REST or RESTful API. So now we are looking at SOAP API, and SOAP stands for Simple Object Access Protocol. Okay, so this is an old API, one of the oldest API that was there before. Although some applications still use this API, this old API protocol, which is SOAP. One major thing you have to understand when it has to do with SOAP, the programming language that is used for SOAP API is XML. XML is the only programming language that can be used for SOAP API. But when it comes to REST API, which we're going to see in the next slide, REST API or RESTful API can use XML and also use Jensen language. So Jensen is a kind of modernized language, but XML is an old programming language. But that is what SOAP uses. So if we can read through here, it said the SOAP API protocol uses extensible markup language. That's what XML stands for, to power API communications. With its first appearance in June 1998, SOAP is the oldest protocol still in use today. So it's the oldest, but it's still in use today. So the question you ask me, what is a protocol? You have protocol and you're not talking about language. So, okay, let me explain this. So protocol is like, let's say if I want to communicate with you, okay, let's say in a situation where you have, let's say United Kingdom wants to establish a communication with Spain. So this political communication will have to go maybe via the foreign secretaries, like United Kingdom or the Britain, they have their own foreign secretary, and Spain also has their own foreign secretary. Okay, so the foreign secretary of Britain is the API of Britain. So because Britain is going to interface with Spanish government via these two APIs of foreign secretary, right? The foreign secretary, Britain foreign secretary, will interface with Spanish foreign secretary. Okay, now for this communication to be established, they have to agree on the protocol that they're going to use to communicate. They could say that the protocol of our communication will be via email. Remember, email is not a language, it's just a protocol or method or way of our communication, or they could say our communication will be via phone calls, right? So they are establishing a protocol via which they will communicate. Now, the next thing will be, which language are we going to use to communicate? Let's say if UK wants to send information to Spain, they could convert, they can email using English. Okay, they are not agreeing on the language based on the protocol. Maybe they say that whenever we're going to, if we're using an email, which is the protocol we have agreed on, Spain says, okay, we'll receive this communication in English language. Then when the Spanish foreign secretary receives this communication or this email in English language, now for him to be able to transmit this message to the actual recipient, which is the, let's say, Spanish government or the other leaders, political leaders, he might need to interpret it into Spanish language, right, for the leaders there to take it. So you could work in an API where you have an API that will receive the request in, let's say, in Jensen, and they will now have to do a kind of transformation into another protocol, which might be SOAP. So let's say that the backend system is developed using SOAP, and the front end system, which is a modern API, maybe was built using REST. there could be an API that will sit in the middle that will receive REST API, REST requests, okay, which is in Jensen or it could be in XML. But let's say if the request came in Jensen and the target system that will receive that request is built using SOAP. There's a SOAP API, of course, which is XML language. So if the request coming is in Jensen, so the middle API will receive this request, transform it into XML before forwarding it to the target system. I hope you understand it. But basically, you have to understand that SOAP API or protocol uses XML to communicate. You can read more about it. And of course, you can see other smart advantages with when you some advantages of SOAP API. I'm not sure they'll be asking you this in an interview. However, it will be good for you also to know or know some of the benefits of SOAP API. Like I said, here, the protocol primarily uses XML files to transmit data over an HTTP or HTTPS connection. However, it is also flexible enough to transmit data over other protocols, such as simple mail transport protocol, transmission control protocol, which is TCP, and user data protocol. Anyway, let's go to the next slide. So the next one is REST API or RESTful API. So as I said earlier on, REST API uses XML, which is an old language, and also uses Jensen. Jensen is a modernized language, a programming language that's easier to understand. But SOAP cannot use Jensen. So hence, they will not have REST API that can use Jensen. And the advantage with REST is that you can also use XML and as well use Jensen, okay, to enable compatibility. All right. So just understand that. So when you are in an API project, you have to find out what is the type of API you're building. Is it a SOAP API or REST API? When you determine that, of course, if it's a SOAP API, you know definitely it's going to be an XML. So your schema will be in XML, okay? But if it's a REST API, the next question will be, is it XML or Jensen language? So the language of your API determine the type of schema you receive. So the schema will come either in XML or in Jensen. Okay, so these are the two things you need to understand. And also, you need to find out if you are building an API that is sitting in the middle, your front end system and your back end system, what kind of API are they? So when you determine the kind of API, you will now determine whether you need to do transformation before you can forward the request. And if you have to do transformation to forward the request, when you're getting the response, let's say you receive REST Jensen request and you transform it to XML and forward it to the backend system. When the backend system sends the response, you that is sitting in the middle will receive the response in XML. That means you have to transform it again to Jensen before forwarding it to the front end that needs that request. I hope it is clear. Next thing you will need to, your API spec will also contain, which is one of the requirements of the API. What are the security requirements? Okay, so there are so many security requirements, but the basic one I've put here is the TLS, MTLS. MTLS is mutual TLS, okay, and the OAuth 2. So what is TLS or MTLS? So TLS is talking about let's say client server kind of certification or authentication. Let's say when the request comes, okay, TLS is saying that just one side that will do the authentication. So I will give you a certificate that you're going to encode in that request. When you send it, I will not be able to, I will do the, I'll validate it. I'll kind of validate that request to ensure that it's coming from the right source. So the authentication is happening on one side. But when it comes to mutual TLS, the authentication will have to happen on both sides, right? So the two sides will have to do authentication or validation to ensure that, to check the security requirement to ensure that the certificate is correct. Or that's what we call digital certificate. And you can read more about that. So TLS is more like only one party will authenticate that the request. But when it comes to MTLS mutual, means that both parties will have to do the authorization, together. Okay. So how does API work? So simple steps here I've just put out there. An API call, also known as a request, is placed by a client application. So you go on Skyscanner, you enter your request. Skyscanner API will get that request and place it, a client. So this call consists of headers. a request verb, and occasionally a request body. So when you now enter your details, so the API will now receive that request and place it, so call the target API via URL or the endpoint. All right, it's trying to call the backend API. So you can read it here, it's self-explanatory. So I'll read the step 2. So when the API when the okay, an API call, also known as a request, is placed by a client application. This call consists of headers, a request verb, and occasionally a request body. So this request will have the kind of headers and a body. Okay. So step 2, the API uniform resource identifier. That's what URI means. Yeah, is used to process this request for data retrieval from an application to the web server. Once the API receives a valid request, okay, so the API will use URL or endpoint to place the request. So the backend API will receive this request and do all the validation and then place it to where it's supposed to be. The external server or application transmit the requested information back to the API. So the front-end API will call the backend API and the backend API will now respond. That's basically what I've put out here. Okay. So let's do the practical section now. So the practical that we're going to do to see exactly, to see API at work, we're going to use Skyscanner. So for those that don't know what Skyscanner is an application that will allow you to book your flights, or you enter your details where you want to go to, what the date you want to travel. Then this Skyscanner will run a check to be able to pull information from various airlines and to give you options of airlines depending on the request you've entered into. But before Skyscanner came on board, I want to take you into something. So before Skyscanner came on board, many years ago, my uncle that normally travels from Nigeria to United Kingdom. So those years, many years ago, what he normally do, anytime my uncle wants to travel, so let's say this is my uncle here, anytime he wants to travel, he has this flight agent that he will call. So let's say this is the flight agent. So the flight agent is here. So anytime my uncle wants to travel, he will call the flight agent. Okay, I want to travel. I want to go to United Kingdom. So this flight agent will come and receive requests from my uncle. The request will contain the date you want to travel, the country you want to go to, or the city, so many things where you want to go to. So this flight agent is acting like an API for my uncle here. So let me just label this one. This is the flight agent. So say FA. So flight agents for easier understanding. Just follow me. You understand what I'm trying to explain here. So you can understand the power of API. Okay. So let's say he wants to travel now. This flight agent will receive the request from my uncle that where he wants to go to United Kingdom, the date he wants to travel. Do you want a direct flight or connecting flight? Where he gets all this information. So let's say we have BA. This is BA. We have let's say this is okay, I'll call this one BA. So I'll call this one, let's say Air France. Okay, AF, Air France. So these are various airlines. Of course, there are so many airlines, but let me just use these two for now. So my uncle wants to travel. I need BA, Air France, or any airline, but he doesn't have direct contact with any of these airlines to get this information. So he calls the flight agent. The flight agent here neither does not have access to BA or AF. So this flight agent, he has contacts with someone here that works with BA. Also have a contact here with someone here that works with Air France. Okay, so this is my DAS API, the flight agent, and this man here is the interface for BA and is the interface for Air France. So what will happen that this flight agent will receive requests from my uncle, say that I want to travel, and I give him all the information required. So this flight agent here now will now forward the request. So this man here said, okay, this, I have a client that wants to travel. Can you give, and these are his itinerary. Can you give me response, or to give me your flight itinerary, the date you're traveling, the cost, all this information. So he sent the same request to this one here also. So this flight agent does not know what is happening in BA database. He does not know what is happening in Air France. He doesn't even need to know, but he just contacted his contact. But for him to be able to send this request to his contact here or his contact here, they have to establish the protocol of communication. Remember when we talked about protocol, right? How are we going to communicate? Is it going to be via email or is it going to be via phone calls? So that when they agree, they say, okay, maybe it's going to be via email. So let's say we call this one REST API. So they've now established their protocol. Okay. The next thing, which language are we going to use? Is it going to be in English or is it going to be in French? Okay. So let's say it's going to be in English. So they've now agreed on the language. So the language, let's call this one JSON. It could be JSON or it could be XML. But for now, let's just call this one JSON. So they are now agreed on the language. Is it making sense to you? So when he now sends this request to this one, this man here will go here to their database and enter the request. Remember the request, where is the source system? The source system is my uncle, who is the one that needs the information, that needs the response. But he will pass through his API with the flight agent, and the flight agent will send this request to all his contacts. Yeah. So this contact to BA, and he send this the information also, the request also to the to Air France contact. So this one will go to the BA and pull the information. You get the information here. So when he gets the information, he will now forward it to, he's not forwarding it to my uncle. You remember, he forwarded it to his contact here, who is the flight agent. And that's my uncle's API. So the same thing will happen here. This man here will enter the details on the database and he will pull the time the flights are traveling, the cost, and everything, all the information that is required. So he's sending a response, okay, to this man. So this flight agent will now take all this information now. He will now bring it to my uncle to choose the one he wants to go with. So what Skyscanner has done now, which we're going to see in a minute. So Skyscanner has removed this man here and put their API. So this is Skyscanner API that we're going to be making requests. So this Skyscanner API, we're making requests to all these API. So BA have their own API here. Okay. So by the time we go to Skyscanner to see it, if you understand what I've done here, it will make sense for you to understand how API works. Okay. So Skyscanner has their own API. The same thing here, and Air France has their own API. And of course, there are so many airlines that have exposed their APIs to Skyscanner for Skyscanner to integrate with them. So when you now enter your request to Skyscanner, so Skyscanner API will do a kind of check or validation. So when they are happy with the details you've entered, they will call all the airlines that they have APIs integration with. So this API will go and pull this information from their databases and send them to this one, and this one will now send it to the source system. You'll be able to now see all this airline itinerary. Okay, let's jump into Skyscanner now and see example of it. So now I've entered this. I want to travel from London, and I'm going to Port of Spain. Just as an example, it could be anywhere. So you can type any country you want to. Okay, let me see France. So I can say I want to go to Frankfurt. So France. So the date, and why it was possible that when I click this field, it shows me dates. It's not allowing me to type in, was because the schema has defined that the only thing that can go in this field is date. You see the power of schema. Okay. So I will not choose the date. Let's say I choose 2nd of June. It will ask me the return date. So I'll just choose 1 week. Okay. So this one, I'll just choose adults economy. All right. So when I run search, you see what will happen. So if I now run the search, remember before now, these are the information I will give to my flight agent, who might take 1 week before he can bring responses to me. It can take 2 days, 5 days, but the flight agent will now communicate with his contacts with various airlines, and the various airlines, the contacts will now put this information and bring them to the flight agent that will bring this information to me. But look at what API has done. And once I run a search, in a twinkle of an eye, within 2-3 seconds, I'm not getting the responses. See? So why Skyscanner was able to pull this information from this airline, this is British Airways, this is Lufthansa, is because Skyscanner has API integration with British Airways API, with Lufthansa API, with all these airline APIs. See? So because they have API integrations, that's why immediately I put this request. The API now send this request to all the API integration, all the airline that it has API integrations with, and in real time, I got the responses. So you see the power of API. Without API, this wouldn't have been possible. So there are a lot of API behind that is doing all this. So I can tell you that the Skyscanner, they don't care how this database of British Airways, what is going on within there. They don't care to know what is happening with in Lufthansa. So the only thing that happened here is that British Airways, they built their own API and they gave Skyscanner an endpoint that they will use to connect to their database or connect to their application. The same thing happens with Lufthansa. And I can tell you there are a lot of airlines that could be traveling, you know, uh, from Frankfurt to, wherever I'm going to, but they are not showing here because Skyscanner does not have API integration with them. So the ones that are showing here are the ones that Skyscanner has integration with them. I hope you understand this class.